All right, let's set the scene. It's 1993. South Africa is literally on a knife's edge. You've got this really fragile, negotiated peace on one side, and on the other, the very real threat of a full-blown civil war. The old apartheid government is losing its grip, but the road to democracy, it is anything but guaranteed. And it was in this super tense moment that one single event threatened to just burn the whole thing to the ground.
Those are the words of Nelson Mandela, speaking to a nation that was pretty much holding its breath. Now remember, he wasn't president yet, not even close. But in this moment of absolute crisis, he was the one person who could speak for the entire country. And that deed he was talking about? Well, that was the cold-blooded murder of one of South Africa's most popular and beloved leaders.
So, on April 10, 1993, a single gunshot rings out in a quiet suburb. That one shot killed a man named Chris Hani, and it sent a shockwave across the country that pushed the entire peace process right to the very edge of collapse.
Now, what's just mind-blowing is how fast this all went down. On Saturday, Hani is murdered. By that evening, the country is already erupting in these spontaneous, angry protests. The grief was just immediate and totally overwhelming. And by Tuesday, just 3 days later, the situation was so bad that Nelson Mandela himself had to go on national TV to try and pull the country back from the brink.
So to really get why one man's death could have such a devastating impact, we've got to talk about who Chris Hani actually was. See, he wasn't just another politician. To millions of people, he was a hero, he was a freedom fighter, and he was the future.
I mean, just look at this picture. You can feel the charisma, right? The connection he had with people. At the time, opinion polls consistently put him as the second most popular leader in the whole country, right after Nelson Mandela. He had this near idol status, especially among the youth and the activists.
And this slide just lays it all out, doesn't it? He was the head of the ANC's armed wing, the leader of the Communist Party, and a huge player in the ANC's leadership. That 95% vote, that tells you everything about his standing. But, and this is so important, he was the bridge to the militant youth. He was the one leader they really trusted to bring them along in these difficult, often frustrating negotiations. So his murder? This was no accident. It was a calculated, targeted strike aimed right at the heart of the transition.
In this quote, man, it just gets right to the heart of who he was. Hani wasn't in this for personal power or the perks of being in government. His focus was always on deep, fundamental economic change, what he called the social upliftment of the masses who had been completely left behind.
So with Hani dead, you've got this massive power vacuum. The country is just erupting in anger. And who steps into that chaos to face it head-on? Nelson Mandela.
You can just imagine it, right? The aftermath was pure chaos. The formal negotiations, which were already on shaky ground, they just slammed to a complete halt. The country was filled with this raw grief and rage. And the assassin's goal, to start a racial war and blow up the talks, seemed dangerously close to actually happening. Now, this was Mandela's immediate response on the very same day of the murder. And listen to the words he chose: dignity, disciplined. He totally understood the anger. He felt it too. But he also knew that if that rage wasn't disciplined, it would play right into the hands of the people trying to destroy the country's future. And this is the key takeaway, right here. When Mandela addressed the nation, he acted as a de facto head of state. He took charge. He commanded the moment. It was a clear signal to everyone that even though he didn't have the official title, he held the nation's trust. As one negotiator later said, it was the night that we saw Nelson Mandela as a statesman.
But here's where the story gets really incredible. Mandela and the ANC didn't just calm the nation down. They took all of this grief, all of this political pressure from the crisis, and they masterfully flipped the script. They used it as a lever, a catalyst, to break the political deadlock for good.
So what did they do? Right away, the leadership gets together and they come up with these 3 demands. 3 things that were absolutely non-negotiable. And what was number 1? An election date. No more delays, no more stalling. The idea was to channel all that grief into a concrete political win. This turned a moment of potential disaster into a moment of incredible leverage.
And that leverage wasn't just talk. We're talking about 1.5 million people hitting the streets in marches across the country. And they weren't just mourning. They were demanding a date for South Africa's very first democratic election. The government simply could not ignore the will of the people any longer.
So, did it work? All that pressure, all that grief and anger channeled into one single purpose? You bet it did. This was the final, decisive push towards freedom.
And this was it, the breakthrough moment.
Cyril Ramaphosa, who was the ANC's chief negotiator, later said that setting this election date was the real victory of the whole process. Because once that date was locked in, the transition to democracy was now, finally, irreversible. This message, which you saw in memorial posters everywhere at the time, really became the defining story of the tragedy. His death wasn't for nothing. It was seen as the ultimate sacrifice that directly unlocked the country's first free election. Think about the irony. The assassin had hoped to start a war, but instead, he accidentally sped up the arrival of democracy.
But even with that incredible victory, the story doesn't quite end there. Because even today, decades later, the assassination of Chris Hani leaves South Africa with this profound, lingering, and unanswered question.
Yeah, what if? What if he hadn't been killed that day? What kind of influence would he have had on post-apartheid South Africa? Would he have become president after Mandela? It's honestly one of the great what-ifs of modern history.
And let's break this down, because it's fascinating. We all know Mandela's incredible legacy is defined by his focus on racial reconciliation, on building a single nation under the rule of law. Hani, of course, shared the goal of a non-racial democracy, but his primary focus was different. It was on economic restructuring, that social upliftment he talked about. He represented a path that might have prioritized economic equality just as much as, or maybe even more than, political reconciliation. His survival could have profoundly changed the economic path of the new South Africa.
In the end, we can't ever know for sure what might have been. But what is certain, as Hani's biographer puts it so well, is that his death was an incalculable loss. He was a leader forged in the struggle, whose assassination nearly plunged his country into war, but whose death, in a strange twist of fate, ultimately paved the final, irreversible steps toward the democracy he fought his entire life to achieve.